Even though we can talk about this turn of the century, this Belle epic, this time of middle class expansion in Western Europe and some of the larger cities in Eastern Europe, the majority of people in Europe are agricultural workers at the turn of the century. And this is something we can't forget. That, and depending where you're at, it can be as high as 90% of the population being employed in some kind of agricultural pursuit. And again, depending where you were, would be an indication of the level of poverty with this, because agricultural work in Europe, the turn of the century, is still in many ways equated with impoverished conditions. And in some areas of Central Europe, we have rising levels of standard of living for the very poor in these agricultural communities. What does that mean? That means they have enough to eat. That's an essential part, which is we take for granted, but they have the ability to purchase goods, even just small goods, personal items, and they generally have enough money and the ability to live a life where they can sustain their family. And that's in certain areas. For example, you'd see this more in Germany and in parts of Hungary. Their lives are, again, it's poor, but not completely destitute. Whereas if you head towards Russia, the lives of the peasants are completely destitute, almost universally, almost in every year. And depending on the rains of each year and the weather conditions, it would depend on how big the famine is for that year, because generally there was a famine no matter if there was bad weather or not. And bad weather can just exacerbate a horrendous situation more than ever. What's the life like for a peasant in Russia at the turn of the century, where they're living in a one-room hovel with maybe some kind of fireplace inside? Not always the case. They're covered in soot and dirt. Their farm animals, if they have any, live in their own home. There is no type of plumbing or sewage. People squat in their own homes. So the house is covered in filth and dirt. There's generally never enough food to eat. The children are easily prone to early death if they survive being born to begin with. Women, children, and men are emaciated most of the time, and there is no end in sight to that poverty at the turn of the century. And along with that went migration. So if you could afford or figured out a way possibly to get to North America, that was the case. At the turn of the century, there's a rising tide of Central and Eastern Europeans coming to North America. So if you look at mid-19th century, we see large migrations from more Western nations, Western European nations, for example, large numbers coming from Ireland. Once we get to the turn of the century, now we have new immigrants coming to the region to work the mines and such on the East Coast and fill the factories of the East Coast in North America. And some of this is a rising tide of anti-Semitism. So, for example, in Russia, pogroms where Jews are attacked and killed at the turn of the century are on the rise, and some of these are supported by the state. And they are restricted in their migration. Jews are restricted in migration or in living conditions, and many were banned from living in Moscow and St. Petersburg and such. So, turn of the century, 2.8 million Russians come to North America, and 1 million of those are Jews. In Central European, Austria-Hungary area, We have a large number of of the Polish nationality living in the Austro-Hungarian region. The area is known as Galicia in the northeast. Very large populations leaving from that region. This is the most impoverished area of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. We see this in the Romanian region, Slovakia, Serbian, etc. So sometimes there were companies in North America who would raise funds to bring these people over, and then they would pay it off as they basically worked their way off, worked their bill off, and again they're going to get to America and they're going to be in squalid, terrible conditions, but those conditions are still better than what was in Russia, for example, under the worst. So there's this pressure valve in Europe at the time period in the 1900s where when conditions got worse, there was a place where people could migrate, and global migration was a way of increasing wealth in Europe, because as the poor left, you're decreasing your population, which allows for limited resources to be spread more favorably to those who are left behind in many ways. So this pressure valve is going to be sealed off following World War I, and that's going to change a lot of the conditions in Europe, and it's going to change societal pressures as well. And we look at what happens in the 1930s when there is repression of certain minorities throughout Central and Eastern Europe. There's nowhere for them to go, as there were at the turn of the century. And we'll talk about what might be the cause of some of the atrocities that happen when that pressure valve is gone in many ways. What does the continent look like? Central Europe is, again, it's agriculturally based. It's not mechanized in most areas. Many new farm techniques have still not reached the outer regions of Europe, whereas areas like Germany is a highly industrialized, mechanized, urbanized nation as compared to some of the others. France is in ever decline in terms of keeping up with the German powerhouse. Britain, too, really, although it's at its height of its power at the turn of the century, it has lost its entrepreneurial innovation that it once had in the early part of the 19th century. And that innovation is now more towards Germany especially. And Germany is the rising power in terms of industry and chemical manufacturing and many other areas on the continent. What about in Southern Europe? Italy is still an agriculturally based nation that's very poor. And again, we had many, part of that 19th or turn of the century migration, much of that is from Italy and in Sicily. And when we think of Little Italy today in New York or South Philly and Philadelphia, those waves of Italian immigrants come at that time and set up small enclaves in the large North American cities. Again, they're escaping rural poverty. Southeastern Europe is extremely poor. This is the area that was ruled by the Ottomans. The Ottomans are slowly pulling out of the region, have lost control, and there's this ever-increasing tension as who will gain control. But the people, again, are living agricultural-based lives in a region that is very difficult to grow crops. And this, too, is a very poor region of Europe at the turn of the century.